Welcome to the symposium on remaking the university and economy in China. And we have been moved by cosmic forces for this symposium, which was originally scheduled to start at 1:30 p.m. And then we were informed that our symposium coincided with once-in-a-lifetime total solar eclipse. So we, moved by the cosmic forces, adjusted to start at 4 p.m. So welcome and thank you for coming to this symposium. My name is Victor Ni, the director of the Center for the Study of Economy and Society, and that center is sponsoring this event. And it's a very exciting event because we will be exploring with two of the most amazing scholars, the remaking of the university and economy in China. Now, why do I use the word remaking in coming up with this title? Well, remaking is an active process. And it was the title of a book which I co-authored called Remaking the American Mainstream. And that remaking has transformed American society from a society which I grew up in that was 85% Anglo, 12% African American, 0.4% Asian American, and less than 1% Mexican American. So that was remade through the passage of the Civil Rights legislation and the new Immigration Act of 1965. So that's remaking the rules of the game and remaking the institutions of societies adapting to institutional change in the rules of the game. So China has been in the process of remaking its economy and society. And two of the most important areas of remaking have been the reform of higher education, which had been built in post-1949 China around the Soviet model, which was an extension of the German model of the research university, a very hierarchical system of education. But in the 21st century, China looked to the United States and saw that in the United States, the research university was thriving. It had become the best research universities in the world, replacing that of Germany as the center of research and learning and training of students. And so China decided to remake the Chinese university, looking to the United States for a model of a research university, which made perfect sense because it was universities like Stanford, Berkeley, MIT that was key in the emergence of the United States as a high technology economy. Computer science, microchips, all that came from the university. So the knowledge economy of the late 20th century and now of the 21st century. So China has, I was told by John Hopcroft at a meeting earlier, 4 years ago, well, he told me China opens a new university once a month, the scale of Cornell University. That's really quite amazing on a monthly basis. And so today China trains every year 600,000 engineers. 600,000 engineers. It trains the engineers specializing in artificial intelligence in a volume greater than all other countries combined. So if you want to find a specialist in artificial intelligence, you look for people who were trained in China. So this has been an enormous investment by China's developmental state, which is much misunderstood. It is a development state that learn from the experience of Japan, from South Korea, from Singapore, to use industrial policy to the effect of remaking institutions like the university, massive investment, and also the investment in remaking the economy and moving swiftly from a low-end, cheap labor manufacturing economy to a rapid transition to a high technology manufacturing economy. So the university is clearly involved in this, in the training of knowledge workers, professionals, students, and in the campus that educates them. And they're linked to the economy in the most intimate way. And I saw this in Shenzhen. I visited Shenzhen, gave a lecture at the Chinese University of Shenzhen, and I was very impressed with the level of university involvement in this key high technology regional economy. And so we see two major institutions, the university remade with massive investments from a developmental state, and we see the economy remade from a low-end, cheap, high-polluting economy in a fast movement to reliance on clean energy and high technology. And today we have the enormous opportunity to learn from the experience of two of the academic leaders of the reform, one of the reform of higher education. Both are involved in the reform of higher education and also the remaking of the economy. And without saying more, I'd like to pass the microphone to Ava Tardos, who's the John Good Sherman Professor of Computer Science and the Associate Dean of the College of Computer Science and Engineering. And Ava?
So welcome everyone, and thank you for the honor to introduce John. I guess one small mistake to correct, I'm not Associate Dean. I was Associate Dean before I agreed to be Department Chair in 2020. So Associate Dean is in my past. But this time I want to talk about John Hopcroft. So John retired from his position at Cornell as an IBM Professor of Engineering and Applied Mathematics a couple years ago. He originally received his degrees from Seattle as an undergrad and then Stanford as a PhD student. Spent some years at Princeton as a faculty before he joined Cornell in 1967. He has done an incredible amount for Cornell during his long Cornell career, which includes he served as one term as department chair and one term as Dean of Engineering. So thank you, John, for all you have done. On the research part, he's most known for his work on algorithms and automata theory. He's co-authored 4 different classical books on this, where the one that's closest to my heart is the algorithms book with him and Al-Eho, which I really loved as learning algorithms. And I wrote my own textbook that's now getting used not only at Cornell, but Berkeley and many other schools, in part because I wanted to take teaching algorithms back to the way Aho and Hopcroft intended it to be taught. So it definitely, the structure of the book is modeled after the structure of your book. Hopefully you agree with that, that's what happened. He got awarded by the Turing Award, which is definitely by far the biggest distinction of a computer science scientist can get for fundamental achievement in design and analysis of algorithms and data structures, so in this area. He graduated a truly impressive number of students, 36 students, and largely his list of students is pretty much a who is who in computer science. According to Math Genealogy, which is a mediocre source here, has 438 academic descendants. And this is definitely a way undercount because Math Genealogy only knows about 21 of his 36 students. So because I guess these are computer science and not all of them register on the math side. He has many distinctions. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, National Academy of Engineering, Foreign Academy of of foreign member of the Chinese Academy of Sciences and many others. For general service to our country, I want to maybe say that in one example, in 1992, he was appointed by President Bush to the National Science Board. That's certainly one of the big services he did for this country. But in the context of this lecture, I think I should emphasize how much John has done to improve computer science and computer science education in the developing world more generally. So when I was first interacting with John on this, he was working in Vietnam to improve Vietnam's education. He has done stuff in Chile, in India, and most recently an awful lot in China, and more recently focusing on China. In 1910, he was appointed an Einstein Professor of China's Academy of Sciences. In 16, he received what is viewed as the biggest honor awarded by the Chinese government to a foreign expert, the Chinese government's Friendship Award. There are two different centers that are named after him in China. Shanghai Jiaotong University has a Hopcroft Center for Computer Science, and Chinese University in Hong Kong, Shenzhen, has opened the Hopcroft Institute. So he's definitely been recognized and has worked really hard and done a lot. And I was asked to keep my remarks short, so I want to just stop here and ask John to tell us about his views on reforming computer science and education and higher education in China. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing from you how this all goes. Thank you, John.
It's a pleasure to be here and tell you a little bit about education in China. I've been working in China for about 30 years. I've taught classes, I've worked with faculty, told them about computer science education. I spoke at a number of conferences, and I've been advising government officials. China is primarily run by a premier, and under him are 4 vice premiers. And at the next level down, there are about 60 cabinet members, broken up into groups of 15, and each group reports to one of the vice premiers. Most individuals that I interact with are government employees, and they all have 5-year terms, and they're evaluated, and they can have at most 2 terms in what they're doing. And this includes university professors and university presidents. University presidents are government employees. They have a 5-year term, and they can have at most 2 terms at their institution. And they're evaluated. If they do well, they get a better job. If they don't, well, they'll be given some job somewhere. Okay, well, it turns out that one of my successes in China was to change the metrics by which university presidents are evaluated. And I'll tell you a little bit about that. But I have visited China maybe 40 times. I used to go for just short visits because I was teaching at Cornell. A short visit sometimes is 1 day. But now I go twice a year. My wife and I go for 3 months, then we're here for 3 months, and we just alternate back and forth 3 months. And today, I'm going to talk about what I've learned, and I'm also going to tell you how things can go wrong if you don't understand the culture, if you're working in a different culture. I'll try to point out some of the curious things that happened because I don't understand Mandarin, and I don't really understand the culture. I talk to students, faculty, support staff, and government officials, but I don't really talk to the general population, and I don't understand Mandarin. So there's a problem there. But I should also point out, I don't understand US culture because I talk to faculty and students and government employees and people who live in Ithaca, but I don't really talk to the person who drives the taxi or runs the garbage collection or the store and so forth. And I've discovered that I don't understand the US culture either. But I'll mention a few things. Chinese students are too focused on education to explore and discover what they really enjoy. Chinese students are excellent in solving problems. In fact, my experience has been they're much better than US students. But they do not explore new directions. If you ask them what direction should we go in, they'll look at you and wonder, what are you talking about? China, by the way, is aware of this issue and its consequences, and they're trying to solve it. And they know that solving this is going to be important to science in China. I'm going to tell you a story about one of the things that can go wrong. If I'm teaching a small class in Shanghai Jiaotong University, I will invite the students over to our house, maybe 4 or 5 at a time, to talk to them and get to know them. And I was talking to one student. He was a senior, majoring in computer science. And I said, "How do you like what you're doing?" And he said, "I hate computer science." And so I asked him, I said, "Well, why are you majoring in it?" And he said, "Well, my parents told me to major in computer science, so I'll get a good job." So this is part of their culture. And there's just changing the culture is not easy. I'm going to talk a little bit about high school in China. My understanding is, well, both high school and elementary school starts at 8 in the morning and goes to 5 at night, and students get homework. And when they get home, their parents then put them in tutoring classes in the evening. So they have no time to explore and find out what they really enjoy. In the United States, when I went to school, classes started at 9 and ended at 3:15. And furthermore, I had an hour in there to do the homework, so I didn't do any homework. I did it during the hour that was assigned. And both my parents worked, so when I got home at 3:15, they told me, "Do whatever you want to do. Just be home in time for dinner." And in the evening, I was told, "Just do what you want to do." And so I had time to explore and find out what I really enjoyed. China is trying to fix this problem. They know that to improve science, they have to give children a chance to grow up and explore and be curious. And so one of the things that they did is they abolished tutoring companies. But that didn't work because then parents hired private tutors. So it's a cultural problem, and how to change a cultural problem is hard. One's interests change during their lifetime. And when I got to be about 60, I wanted to do something to improve education somewhere which would really be significant. And I worked in a number of countries, as Ava mentioned, Mexico, India, Saudi Arabia, Chile, Colombia, Brazil, Vietnam, Hong Kong, and I forget how many others. But I had no impact, no systemic impact on education in any of these nations. And the reason was the nation's improving education was not a high priority. But when I got to China, I discovered that improving education was one of the highest priorities, and there was an opportunity to have a systemic impact on education. And to tell you just how important education is in China, about 20 years ago, parents discovered that their child had to get a university education to get a good job. And the number of students applying to universities increased at 1 million per year. Now, a university, the size of Cornell, can only handle about 20,000 students. And so what China did is they built 50 universities the size of Cornell per year I think it was about for 20 years. So this was 1,000 universities. And this wasn't all done just because the quality of education was so important. Another high priority is stability of the country. And they didn't want a large number of parents upset because their children couldn't get into a university. But you might ask now, where did they get the faculty? And that's a problem. And so one of the things, I was invited over and to work with 50 faculty for 3-week periods and try to upgrade the faculty. But here something happened which was important. I didn't realize how important it would be. What they did is they asked me what my consulting fee would be. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to have an impact, and I didn't care if I was paid. So I said, my consulting fee is 0 if the opportunity will actually have a systemic impact on China. If it won't, I won't do it no matter what you offer me. And I explained to them that hiring someone for 3 weeks, hiring a consultant doesn't make sense. The person will be there for 3 weeks, but when his funds run out, he'll go, and he won't even figure out what the problem is in 3 weeks. I told China they needed to find people who were willing to work for several years and actually have an impact. And I told them that there were a fair number of people who were 60 years old, and they would be happy to come to China and work if they could have an impact. And you don't have to pay them, just cover their expenses. I was talking to low-level people, and this was really news to them, that there were people who were willing to work for nothing. What they did is they passed the information up, I believe, to higher-level officials. Because all of a sudden, I was contacted by high-level people asking me to work with them. And I'll just mention one of them, the president of Shanghai Jiaotong University. This is one of the top universities in China. Asked me if I would become a counselor and advise him. I don't know quite what the job is, but he said, look, he couldn't appoint me until he talked to the party leader. And what you have to realize is that every government employee is evaluated by a party leader. And so I had dinner a couple of nights with the party leader, and then the president said he could appoint me. And one of the things, people seem to have, in the United States, negative views about the party. And my view of it is China has a one-party system. The US has a two-party system. We call our parties Democrats and Republicans. China calls their party members. And they actually do have an important role because they evaluate people. And the other difference, of course, between China and the US is China has a central control and we have a distributed one. But there are advantages and disadvantages of every form of government. And there are a lot of advantages in having a central system, because in the United States, if I tried to improve university education, I could work with one university. In China, I can have an impact on thousands of universities, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Politicians, I'll mention one of them that you might know. The first vice premier, the former one whose term ended last April, Li He. I don't know if I pronounced that right. He is the person that China sent to the United States to negotiate with Trump over tariffs. But in his portfolio, not only does he have finance and a number of things, but he also has science. And so he invited 8 of us to advise him how to improve science in China. Now, one of the things, whenever I get an invitation at this level, you get 5 minutes. So you better think, what is the one thing you're going to tell them, and how are you going to say it? Because that's it. But coming back to Shanghai Jiaotong University, I was asked to chair the Computer Science Faculty Recruiting Committee. And I worked hard, and I hired a couple of good faculty for them, and was continuing to do this. But then the first 2 faculty I hired resigned. And I interviewed them, and I said, why? And they said, well, look, there is so much pressure to raise research money and publish papers, we're not interested. So I went to the president, and I told him, I said, look, unless you change the environment, it doesn't make sense for me to continue to recruit for you. And his response was, he said, look, John, I can't change the environment of the entire university. That's not possible. But what I will do is I will create a center for you. And you can hire faculty in the center, and I'll give you complete control over the environment. So he said, I could set the salary, I could set the teaching load, but more important, I could set the promotion standard. So I started hiring faculty for the center, and first year I had to really struggle. I managed to hire 5, but they didn't believe when I told them you don't have to raise research money or publish papers or work for a senior faculty. But when they came and discovered it was true, they told their neighbors back at US universities, and all of a sudden it became easy to hire 5 faculty a year. And so I hired 25 faculty by now. And there's an international organization which evaluates departments and faculty. And you can restrict it if you want. So I restricted it to China. And I said, what is the top theoretical computer science unit in China? And lo and behold, it was my center. The next thing I did is I asked, who are the top 15 theoretical computer scientists in China? And it turned out 8 of them were in my center. Now, one of the ways universities get evaluated, the president of PKU, Hao Ping at that time, he observed if a freshman was admitted to PKU and to Shanghai Jiaotong University, which one would they go to? And about 85% of them went to PK University. But then all of a sudden it changed. Shanghai Jiaotong University now gets 85%. And so Hao Ping traced it to my center and said, we would like to have a similar center. And I said, that's fine. If you'll give me the same environment, we'll do it. So we created a center at PKU. But I didn't want a lot of things named after me, so I said, let's give it some other name. I didn't realize that names are important in China, and so I've changed that. So HUST in Wuhan has created a center, and this. But one of the things is I don't believe in centers. That what you really want to have is strong departments where you have world-class faculty, you have students, and they're working together. In my centers, I have faculty, but I have no students. So I have to find departments that let me teach some of their courses. But I went back to the president of Shanghai Jiaotong University because since I now had 25 faculty, I felt I could merge the center with the department and hiring would not be compromised. But the president said, no, you can't do that. Your center has built a brand for Shanghai Jiaotong University, and it helps us attract higher quality students. So keep your center. And I explained to him, but I have no students. He said, no problem, I'll create a class for you. So what he told me, he said, each year, Shanghai Jiaotong University admits 200 students to computer science. When they show up in the fall, interview them and pick the 40 that you want and put them in your class and give them a world-class education. That's what I'm doing now. But I'll tell you now something that metrics are very important. When I would teach a course at Shanghai Jiaotong University, particularly if I taught 200 students, I would notice that half of them were as good as the best student here at Cornell, but the other half were pretty bad. And I think what happens is some people were admitted because they were really good students. Others were admitted because they were really good at taking exams, and they knew how to get the top score in the Gaokao exam. So what I told faculty in my center, I said, when you go to pick the 40 students we want, don't look at the academic records, because all of them have academic records, good records, and it's not going to help. So what you should do instead is just talk to them for 20 minutes. And from that discussion, figure out whether the person is really excited about learning and doing something, or they're just happy to be at Shanghai Jiaotong University. And we're able to pick, using this 20-minute discussion, 40 students who are in the top half. Okay, now I'll tell you one other thing where you can make a mistake because of the culture. The premier invited me to fly over to China, and he said for a meeting from 5 to 6 and dinner from 6 to 7. Now, if you got an invitation like that in the United States, you might believe, well, that meeting from 5 to 6 is going to be a cocktail hour. And the premier will be there, but everybody will be standing around him, telling them who they are and so forth. There'll be no substantive discussion. And then you'll go to a dinner and there'll be 100 people. So there'll be 10 tables. The premier will be on this table over here and I'll be over there. I probably wouldn't even get a chance to talk to him. So I was going to turn the invitation down, particularly since I was teaching Monday, Wednesday, Friday here. It was a Monday meeting. I'd have to catch a plane on Saturday, arrive Sunday, go to the meeting and the dinner on Monday, fly back Tuesday, which I'd gain a day, and could teach my class Wednesday. So I wrote a staff member. The government has assigned some staff to help me. I wrote one of them and I said, will I even get a chance to speak to the premier? And fortunately, I got a message back saying, you've been allocated 5 minutes. This is something that is always, don't feel that short. You know, if you get a meeting, it's always at most 5 minutes. So I decided to go. And what I hadn't realized is two things. Well, first of all, in the morning, there would be meetings and I'd meet a large number of high-level officials, but also it wasn't a cocktail hour. 3 of us got 5 minutes and we got to tell the premier something. But in the morning, staff told me the premier wanted me to chair an international board which would tell China how to improve university education. And I thought, oh, this is going to be terrible, because there's preschool, kindergarten, elementary school, high school. We're going to spend hours. But I thought, the premier flew me over, and if this is what he wanted, I better not say no. So I said, okay, I'll chair it. Then the staff told me, your report can be at most 1 page. And this is something you ought to know. If you're ever asked to do a report, it's 1 page. Now, everybody on this committee was a university professor from some nation, so we quickly agreed we would just focus on university education. And because there were 2 from members from Germany who were really strong. The three of us agreed we'll figure out just one message. What is the one most important message we can give the premier? And what we said, at that time, universities were being evaluated on whether they raised their international ranking. And we said, abolish that metric and replace it with the quality of instruction. And the way to measure the quality of instruction is have someone from a different university sit in on a lecture and see if the faculty member teaching the course was engaging the students, was excited and knowledgeable about the material, and what fraction of the students were listening. It's very subjective. It's like if you were evaluating an ice skater, okay? But it can be done. The premier wrote, I won't go through the method. I'm not sure the premier even sees the report. He has so many things he has to worry about that his staff sends it to every cabinet member who could be impacted. So it went to the Minister of Education, the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Science and Technology, and so on. And each of these people had to write what they thought. And so our report became about 10 pages, and the premier wrote on it, implement, and gave it to the Ministry of Education. But the Ministry of Education was a little bit nervous. We had given a subjective way to evaluate universities. And they were afraid, they're government employees, remember, and have 5-year terms, and they're going to be evaluated. And they were afraid they would be criticized that they were favoring friends or something. So we had a number of meetings. It was maybe about 3 meetings that were going on. I didn't know how we were going to solve it. But finally, by accident, I said something I probably shouldn't have said. These meetings is talking at people at the director level. This is below not a minister or a vice minister, but a level below that. And they are on their side of the table, and there are about 10 of them, and my team was on my side, and we weren't getting anywhere. And I had suggested if they didn't want to do the evaluation, let me do it. But we didn't get anywhere. But way over in the side of the room, who wasn't participating at all, was a vice minister. And by accident, it turned out the next month the premier was going to fly me back. And I said, next month the premier is flying me back, and it's going to be very embarrassing to me personally if I have to tell him we've made no progress. At that moment, this vice minister, who never said anything, simply said, we approve your doing evaluation. Everybody in the room got up and left. And so the people on my side who understood Mandarin, they said, we'll negotiate exactly what you've got. And from that, I started to evaluate the top 40 universities in computer science. And the budget I had was about $3 million a year. And I used 200 faculty because I had faculty from a different universities sitting in on lectures. And one of the things is this gave me a list, a ranking of the top 40 universities. Now, it's not a very good ranking. The top one isn't better than the 5th one. So I broke it into top third, middle third, bottom third. And then I wrote a letter to each president and said, the teaching at your institution is either in the top third, middle third, bottom third. And each year I tried to get the Ministry of Education to take the job back because it'd be much better if they did it. But they said, no, just keep doing it. Until a year ago. And all of a sudden, Ministry of Education changed its mind. What happened is the quality of instruction at these 40 universities went up. And they traced it to the letter that I was sending to the presidents. Because remember, these presidents have 5-year terms, and then they're going to be evaluated. And they realized that maybe a major component of their evaluation was the quality of instruction. So they told a vice president, focus on improving instruction and that. So the Ministry of Education is going to take it over. But they asked me to continue for 2 years till they get organized. And when I talked to them, they're not actually taking it over, they're expanding it. I was doing one discipline, they're going to do all disciplines. I was doing 40 universities, they're doing all universities. And I can't figure out how many universities there are in China. Some people tell me there's as many as 3,000. Others tell me it's only somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000. But anyway, MOE, looking at the cost, it's going to cost them $100 million a year to do this. And instead of using 200 faculty like I was, it's going to take 20,000 faculty. And so I asked them, where are you going to get the budget? And they told me, well, we're not actually going to do it. What we're going to do is we're going to transfer the project to the vice governors of the provinces that are responsible for education in the provinces. And what the Ministry of Education's job will be to evaluate how well the vice governors responsible for education implement the project. So this is kind of how things work. I talked to the vice governor in Hubei province, and he told me he had 191 universities. So it's not that much bigger than when I was doing 40. It's not like trying to do, assigning someone to do 3,000 universities. But one of the things is, in evaluating teaching, I learned a lot. And I will tell you sort of what I learned. One of the things I learned is that the faculty at the top universities are fluent in English. And they can look at US and European universities and get the current curriculum. But once you get outside of the top universities, the faculty are not fluent in English. And China has got to develop material, first-rate material in Mandarin for them. That was one of the things that became clear. The other thing that became clear is there are lots of ways to improve education. And I'll just tell you a story of one of them that I mentioned to the Minister of Education. I was evaluating a class with 30 students. The faculty member teaching it was world class. Now, the course was being taught in Mandarin, so I don't know what she was saying. But when she started teaching, every student was involved. But halfway through the course, or about 30 minutes in, she wrote a mathematical theorem on the board. And all of a sudden, half of the class disengaged. And so I kept notes of what happened during that. And then she spent 20 minutes proving the theorem. So afterwards, I told her, I didn't tell her how to improve teaching. I simply told her what happened. And I said, what do you think about this, that the 30 students disengaged? And she told me, she said, well, maybe I wrote that mathematical theorem on the board and they didn't understand it. Maybe what I should have done is mention this theorem intellectually and then worked with the class to convert that intellectual statement into a precise mathematical statement. And then I said something about, also you spent 20 minutes proving the theorem. What do you want students to know about the lecture 6 months later? And she said, well, probably not the proof. She said, maybe what I should do is instead say, if you want to prove this theorem, here are the key ideas you need. Okay, now notice I didn't try to tell her how to teach better. I simply told her what happened and said, what do you want, what can you do about it? And so that would be a good way of improving education. You don't want to tell someone how to teach because every faculty member has their own style. And if you try to force them to teach the way you do, you're probably going to lower the quality. But I thought I should then talk to the Minister of Education and tell him what I know. So I asked for a meeting. And to get a meeting when you asked for it, his staff interviewed me to find out what I was going to say. And then they talked to many people I worked with to see if what I was doing was reasonable. And I think the Minister of Education made a decision to fund what I was going to tell him before the meeting even occurred. But then he needed some Chinese organization to fund. So he told Hao Ping, who was the president of PKU, to come to the meeting with me. And I spent 3-4 minutes telling the Minister of Education what I thought China should do. And at that point, he simply pointed to Hao Ping and said, I'll give you all the resources you need. I want you to implement what John just said in the top 30 universities in China. China doesn't start national projects. They start with a small project, and if it works, they expand it. If that works, it gets expanded. But this project became what's now called Project 101. Hao Ping went back to the university, back to PKU, and I noticed that he had a meeting of all his vice presidents, and they figured out 3 people to assign this project to. And then those 3 people contacted the 30 universities and asked each university to assign someone to the project. And they should all come to Beijing, and then I was asked to tell these people what should be done. And you should realize if you're in that situation, you better figure out exactly what you're going to tell them and make it absolutely clear so that they won't get it wrong. I didn't quite realize that. And I talked to these 30 people and told them what I thought should be done. But I didn't realize I was the only person who knew. But it became reasonable. But one of the things I told them is for each course, to create a portfolio. So one of the first things that these 30 individuals did is they figured out what they thought were the key courses in computer science. And then for each course, they figured who was the top person in China to assign it to. And it started from there. So this notion of a portfolio, which I suggested, was to get 20 or 30 faculty involved in this area and have each of them make a list of the topics that are important for the course, and then take these lists and merge them, and then ask each faculty member to write up 2 or 3 of the topics, just 3 or 4 pages. This ought to have taken only 3 or 4 weeks to do. And it would be the quality of 20 or 30 faculty. But that's not what happened. They didn't get the notion of a portfolio and a digital document. They wrote books. And actually, there are now 33 books on computer science in China that were developed from this project. Trouble with a book is it takes a year to create, and it's the quality of the author or co-author of just 2 faculty rather than 20 or 30, and it's not going to get updated. If the field is changing, you don't rewrite the book. But the portfolio can be easily updated as new topics arise. Now, one of the things, it took them a year, by the way, to get a book written. So to convince them that they could have done it in 3 or 4 weeks, I picked a topic that they didn't. I picked quantum computing and communication. And I found maybe 20 faculty in China, the best that I could find. And I asked them if they would help me create a portfolio. And when I asked them, I said, send me the list of what you think the key topics should be. So at the end of the first week, I had 20 faculty and a list of the topics. May not be perfect, but it was a reasonably good list. Then I told them, each of you select the 2 topics that you're most excited about and write them up in 3 or 4 pages. And at the end of 3 weeks, I had the portfolio for quantum computing. And I'm going to try to get Project 101 to move into digital, because one of the things, there are subject matters. There's one you may not be aware of called large language models. In computer science, this is very important, but it's probably not developed enough to have a course. So what should China do? If it's an area that's just developing, they should find the best people in China who know something about this and write a portfolio which may only be enough material for 2 or 3 lectures. It's not going to be a course, but any of the 30,000 computer science faculty who are interested in this area could look at the material on quantum computing and communication, and it would start to raise the level before you're at a stage that you can create courses. Project 101 is the initial stage. They decided it was very successful, and they've now extended it to 10 other disciplines. But what is more important is extending it to more universities. They got faculty at the top 30 universities to create material. So I then took this material and started circulating it to universities that were not in the top 200. And the response I got was, this material is world-class, but it's rather theoretical. And the faculty who developed this are at universities that are educating people who often go to the US or Europe for PhD programs. That's not what we do at our university. We educate people to get jobs in industry and work, and we need more applied material. So in the second phase of Project 101, we're going to have to get faculty who are not in the top 100 universities to create material which is appropriate for the lower ranked ones. I'm just about out of time. I'll just want to bring up one other topic, and that is why, if the mission of the university is to educate students, why do top science and engineering departments hire researchers? Well, it turns out there's a good reason. When you hire somebody, you're hiring them for a 40-year career. And you want to hire somebody who 30 years from now will not be teaching material that's 30 years old. So what you're looking for is someone that has 2 properties. One, you want to see what is their energy level. Are they likely to be active in doing stuff for 30 or 40 years? And secondly, are they curious? Because if the field changes and they're curious, they'll probably explore it and upgrade their course. So it's important to hire researchers, but you should not be evaluating the quality of their research, because that's not what you're interested in. What you should be evaluating is, why did they pick the research that they did? If someone says, look, my advisor was working on this and I thought I would just extend it, that's not terrifically good. But if someone says, you know, when I was an undergraduate, I was excited about the following topic, but when I got my PhD program, I found this other topic which was even better. I started there and then I discovered this other and I switched again. Sounds like the person is curious, and that's the person you want. And so when we evaluate people that we're hiring for China, the 25 that I've hired, what we really are looking at is, are they curious and do they have an energy level? And we were very successful. And I'll mention one thing. I tell them, don't waste your time getting research money, and don't waste your time publishing papers, because I'm not going to look at that. I'm going to promote you on other things. 2 things. One is excellence in teaching. That's a necessity. And the other is, are you active in something? And I don't care what. Right. You might ask the question, how can these faculty, where I tell them don't waste your time publishing, have developed such a strong international reputation? And the answer is, I think, because they weren't wasting their time publishing, they were focusing on what was exciting. And they discovered something important, and then they said, I ought to tell the world about this. And although they have very short publication lists, it's excellent. At this time, I'm out of time, but at 5:30, there'll be a reception, right?
It's 6 o'clock.
6 o'clock. And so I'll be at that if anyone wants to ask questions. Yeah.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to welcome Justin to Cornell. There's so much you can say about Justin, but you know, you're here to listen to Justin, not to listen to me talking about Justin. So I'm going to say three very brief things about Justin. And in a way, three firsts. Firstly, Justin was one of the first Chinese PhD students at the University of Chicago after the opening up in the late 70s, and he worked with Nobel Prize winner T.W. Schultz. So he's from that cohort of the first set of Chinese students who went to the University of Chicago. The second thing I would say is that Justin was the first chief economist of the World Bank who was a citizen of a developing country, which is quite remarkable. It actually takes us back to when the two institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, were being set up in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference. And there was a big battle between John Maynard Keynes, who led the British delegation, and Harry Dexter White, who led the American delegation, as to what's going to be the balance of power here. And Keynes was always fighting a rearguard action because it was the last empire against the up-and-coming power. And Keynes argued, well, okay, we'll give you everything, but let the two institutions be in Europe. He lost that battle. He said, okay, we'll give you that, but let the heads of the two institutions be European. Well, he lost that battle. He said, okay, give us one. And really what he meant by European, he meant British. So he got the IMF as a European head, not British, European head, but the World Bank was foreign American. So it's understandable perhaps that the political heads of the two institutions would be American, but the technical heads of the two institutions, the chief economists, that has always been an American until Justin Lin broke the mold. Of course, after Justin, we had our own Kaushik Basu, who's an Indian citizen, and now the current chief economist is Indermeet Gill, who's an Indian citizen. But it was Justin, the dam broke with Justin. The third point I would make to introduce Justin is that when he was at Chicago, and the new structural economics, which he's going to talk about, is essentially, I would say, Justin, a combination of what he learned at Chicago, the power of the price mechanism, the power of incentives, that budget constraints matter, you have to pay attention to them, combined with his experience in China as to how you combine the market and the state. And that is what, in some sense, led to his development of the new structural economics, and that's what we're going to listen to now. Justin, over to you.
Well, it's quite an honor to be invited back to Cornell University. And I was here 20 years ago, also invited by Victor Nin. At that time, the topic was whether the growth in China was real. And at this time, I switched a topic to a broad thing. The rise of China, not only China, the rise of East Asian economies and its implication for economics and for the world. Well, the world was flat in terms of per capita GDP before the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century. Because if you look into some study by a historian like Angus Madison, and in his historical statistics data, it showed that in 700, the rich country was Netherlands. and their per capita GDP measured by purchasing power parity. The purchasing power of 1990 was 2,100 international dollars. In that year, according to the estimation, the per capita GDP in China was 600 international dollars. And in African country, 420 international dollars. And so you can see the gap was very small. And that's the reason why I said, before the modern time, the world was flat in terms of the difference in per capita GDP. But things changed so fast. After the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century, a few countries in Western Europe, then followed by North America, they industrialized. They became rich. But the rest of the world did not have a similar transformation. And so the gap now becomes so large. And people said it was a great divergence between the developed and developing country. And certainly, at that time, most of the developing country was colonized, like in Africa, in South Asia, and so on. But after the Second World War, all the developing countries gained the political independence. And certainly, they all had the aspiration to catch up the advanced country. And for me as an economist, we know how come the Western country became so powerful, so rich, because of Industrial Revolution. And it was a process of structural transformation, because after Industrial Revolution, you had the technological innovation continuously and industrial upgrading continuously to raise the productivity, the per capita GDP, on the one hand. And certainly, you also need to improve the institutions and also infrastructure and to reduce the transaction cost. And that was the process that started in the Industrial Revolution. And for a developing country, as a latecomer to catch up, they share some advantages because they can learn from the advanced country about the technology, about the industry, about the infrastructure, about the institutions. And with that kind of possibility, a developing country should be able to grow faster than the advanced country and converge to the income level of the advanced country, theoretically. But after the Second World War, almost all the countries started this process, try to catch up. But the result was quite disappointing, because as we know, in Latin America country, they have maintained their per capita GDP about 20% to 40% of the advanced country, continuously now for more than half a century. And in Africa and South Asia, their per capita GDP has been maintained about 5% to 10% of the advanced country in the past 50, 60 years. And so we can see most of the developing countries have been trapped in the mid-income status or in poverty. But there was some exception, that in the East Asian economies, they were able to have a continuous rapid economic growth and raise their income and to narrow the gap. Some of them even now overtake the advanced country. For example, Singapore, its per capita GDP now is higher than the per capita GDP in the US. And in Korea, and Hong Kong, now their per capita GDP is about 60%, 70% of the US. And remarkably is China. China was one of the poorest countries before the transition from a planned economy to a market economy in 1978. And from 1978 to last year, 45 years, continuously the growth rate in China was 9% per year on the average. And the economic size increased 47 times. And so it's a puzzling. The possibility is there. And most of the country were unable to benefit from the possibility. And only a few of them were able to really realize their dream of catching up. And so for this puzzling phenomena, I agree with Keynes. Keynes said it is ideas, not vested interest, which are dangerous for good or evil. If you have the right development ideas, you can benefit from the possibility of latecomers and accelerate your growth and closing the gap and catch up. But if you follow the wrong ideas, even the potential is there, but you will not be able to really close the gap. And so let me see, let's look into what kind of idea that we provide to the developing country. As I mentioned, after the Second World War, most of the developing countries gaining political independence, and they want to catch up. That's their national aspirations. And at that time, the understanding that if you want to catch up the developed country, to have the same income level, you should have the same productivity, right? And if you want to have the same productivity, you should have the same advanced industry. And that's a large-scale, capital-intensive industry. But the observation for the economists at that time was, although those kind of advanced industries were enabling you to be as rich as the developed country, but the developing country, due to the culture, due to some kind of structural barriers, they will not be able to do that. Because if you want to own those kind of capital-intensive advanced industry, you need to make a lot of investment. But at that time, developing country, they don't save. And they would not respond to the incentive. Even you raise the interest rate, people would not increase the saving. And so that's the reason why they say due to those kind of structural problems, market would not work. Since the market would not work, sort of the recommendation was that the government need to play some role to mobilize the resources, to make investment in those kind of advanced industries. Very conventional, right? And before the government intervention, certainly they imported industrial product, manufacturing product from the advanced country. And now they wanted to produce those kind of goods by themselves, so they call that import substitutions. And that is the idea of development at that time, seems to be very conventional. And so most of the developing countries, no matter it's in socialist or non-socialist, they follow those kind of recommendations. And with that, they were able to build up the modern industries in China, in India, in North America, in Africa. And they were able to have rapid growth for a few years when they invested in those kind of industries. But after they set up those kind of industries, they all became white elephant. They are not efficient. And as a result, the economy started to be stagnant. And they were hit by crisis all the time. And as a result, the income gap with the one country continued to be widening. And so by the time of 1980s, when China started the transition, actually, almost all the developing countries started the transition from those kind of government-led growth. And in the 1980s, the idea, turned into the observation The reason why the developing country did not do well was because they have too many government interventions in the market and all kind of distortion created by the government. As a result, they had a misallocation of resources and also all kind of rent created by the government, and so they had the rent seeking and so on, and the corruption. And they said that was the reason for the poor performance of the developing country, and especially for the neoliberalism. They say, the market institution is efficient, and if you want to have the similar performance as in the advanced country, you should have similar market institution as in the advanced country. And so the recommendation was the developing country to remove all those government interventions and to privatize their economy, marketize their economy, stabilize their economy, and liberalize their economy, allow the market to function. And the premise was that if you can have similar efficient institutions as in advanced country, you can have similar performance as in advanced country. And since the idea seemed to be so convincing, and as a result, most countries in the 1980s, 1990s, they followed this idea to remove the government intervention and so on. However, those countries followed that approach. Their economy collapsed, hit by crises even more frequent compared to the 1960s, 1970s, during the structuralism. And so some economists refer that as the lost decades for the developing country. And that's the reason why most countries were trapped in middle income status or in low income status. And during this period of time, there were a few economies that did well, as I said, in East Asian tigers, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Korea. They did not follow the recommendation from the structuralism to build up large-scale modern industries. They started with very humble approach. Start with labor-intensive industries, traditional industries. At that time, those kind of approach was considered as a wrong approach. If the high-income country, they build up those kind of advanced industry, and you build up those kind of traditional small-scale industry, how could you catch up the advanced country? Okay. And instead of trying to do the import substitution, they do some kind of export promotion. And at that time, say, if you want to catch up the developed country, you should produce something like a developed country, right? And so you should have import substitution. But they did export promotion, those kind of very humble, very traditional, handicraft type of goods. But it was successful. Okay. And by the time of 1980, 1990, all the countries did the transition. The idea was that you want to transit to a market economy, you should adopt those kind of privatization, marketization, liberalization simultaneously. But a few economies did well during the transition. Like Mauritius, started in 1971, about 10 years earlier than China, then Vietnam, then Cambodia. They maintained stability and dynamic economic growth during the transition from the government-led growth to market-oriented economy. They did not implement those kind of structural therapy, try to bring the well-functioning market institutions simultaneously. Instead, they did do some kind of piecemeal, gradual, dual-track approach. Continue to protect the old industry, but liberalize the entry to the new industries. But in the 1980s, 1990s, there was a consensus. If you want to do the transition, you need to implement all those institutions simultaneously. That is the best approach. But if you allow the market and the state to exist simultaneously, the consensus at that time, that was the worst possible approach. But those successful transition economy, they follow those kind of worst possible approach according to our academic understanding. And also, those successful economies, they are either market economy, like the East Asian tigers to begin with. Well, they transit to market. So it seems to be a market institution is very important. But at the same time, they all have very proactive government. Try to facilitate, try to support certain sectors. So they are neither structuralist policy regime or neoliberalism policy regime. And since I think that the idea of theory is trying to help us to understand and to guide us, right? And the existing theory fail to guide us. And it can also help us to understand why some country fail, some country was successful. So that's the reason why I think we need to have a rethinking of the development idea we have. And for that, I try to bring in the new structural economics, as Ravi just mentioned. And it's some kind of combination. When I try to, rethink this kind of ideas, I say we should go back to Adam Smith. But when I say we should go back to Adam Smith, I do not mean we should go back to the teachings in the wealth of nation. For example, trade is very important, division of labor is very important, you have an invisible hand. I do not mean we should go back to that. I mean we should go back to the approach that Adam Smith used to find out those kind of conclusions. And actually, Adam Smith used his approach as the title of his book. That is to, understanding and inquiry into the nature and the causes of the wealth of nation. We need to understand the nature and the causes of the subject we studied. And since we try to study economic development and economic development after the Industrial Revolution is a process of structural transformation in technology, in industry, in institution, and so on. And so, we need to understand, what are the causes of those kind of structure and structural evolutions. And I want to apply the modern economic approach to study that. And if I apply modern economic approach to study structure and structural evolution, I should refer the type of study as structural economics. Just if I apply this approach to study agriculture, then people say that's agricultural economics. To study finance, people refer that as financial economics. I should refer that as structural economics. But how come I call it a new structural economics? Because as I mentioned, there was structuralism before me. And I try to distinguish my study from the structuralism, so I call new structural economics. Just like new institutional economics is an application of neoclassic approach to study institution and institution evolution. Then it should be institutional economics. But in the US, there was an institutional school in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and to distinguish from institutional school, now we refer that as new institutional economics. So new in a sense, to distinguish from the idea before on the same subject, but different ideas, okay. And the theory of the new structural economic actually is very simple. My main hypothesis is that a country have different production structure, different technology and industry and so on. It's because of their endowment structure are different. And why endowment structure is so important. The endowments for economics, we refer that as the capital, the land, the labor. And those in different countries at a different level of development, certainly they have a different relative abundance in those kind of factor endowments. At one country, they must be abundant in capital. And developing country, there will be scarce in capital. And there will be relative abundant in either labor force or natural resources. And this kind of relative abundance will determine what type of technology industry you're going to have competitive advantages. if you are relatively abundant in capital, certainly you are going to have competitive advantages in capital abundant, capital intensive military or capital intensive industry, and vice versa. And certainly, this kind of competitive advantages, if you follow that, you can have lowest possible factor cost of production. But if you compete in the market, you also need to bring down the transaction cost. So you need to have an infrastructure and also institution in order to turn the competitive advantages from latent to actual. So that's the idea in the new structural economics. And for us, certainly we try to raise our income. If you want to raise your income, certainly you need to move from land-intensive industry or labor-intensive industry to capital-intensive industries. But since that industry is endogenous to the factor endowments, if you want to move up the industrial ladder from labor-intensive to capital-intensive industry, then you need to make a capital become relatively abundant. And if you can make your capital become relatively abundant, certainly you change your competitive advantages, you can upgrade your industry and so on. But at the same time, you also need to improve your hard infrastructure and institution in order to make your competitive advantages from latent to actual. And from this understanding, country who are trapped in low-income status or middle-income status, it means that the country were unable to have this kind of dynamic structural transformation. Okay. And it seems to upgrade, and from this understanding, if you want to make this kind of structural transformation to occur, you need to change your endowment structure. What would be the best way to change your endowment structure? And actually, it's to follow your competitive advantages. Because by that, you can have lowest possible cost of production and provide the industry and technology with suitable infrastructure and institution to lower the transaction cost. By that, you will be competitive. And if you're competitive, you can create a large economic surplus and you have more to save. At the same time, if you follow your competitive advantage in the process of development, the return to investment will be very high, and you will have high incentive to save. And by that, certainly, you can accumulate your capital at the quickest possible way, change your competitive advantage at the quickest possible way. And you can have a very dynamic economic growth. And for a developing country, in this process of industrial upgrading and so on, you have a great amount of advantages. So that seems to be, that is the key spirit of the new structural economics. But to follow the competitive advantages in your economic development is economic jargon, certainly understandable to economists or someone who are educated with economics. But how can we make entrepreneur to follow the principle? Then we need to have two very important institutions. One is a market institution, because you need to have a relative factor prices to reflect the relative abundance of factor endowments. And the only way to get those kind of information is to have a competitive market. And you have that when you are abundant in natural resources or labor force, then the natural resource and labor force will be relatively inexpensive, capital will be relatively expensive. And the entrepreneur, motivated by profit, they will go to the industry which can utilize abundant supply of labor force or natural resources and save the use of capital. Then there will be land-intensive industry or capital-intensive industry, and they will adopt technology, also have that characteristics. That is consistent with your competitive advantage. And alternatively, if you become capital abundant and capital become inexpensive, and then wage rate will become too high, relatively speaking. And then entrepreneur, they will go to capital-intensive industry and reducing the use of labor force and so on, and that will be consistent with your competitive advantages. So in that regard, competitive market institution is very important. But we know that economic development is not just a resource allocation. It's a process structural transformation. And in this process, you need to have a first movers. And we know a first mover encounter all kinds of difficulties, and no matter they are successful or they fail, they always provide useful information for others. That is called externality. So you need to provide incentive for the first movers. And whether the first mover will be successful or not also depends on the one hand, whether they go to the right industry or not. But they also need to have adequate institution and infrastructure. But entrepreneurs, they will not be able to, to build up institution or infrastructure by themselves, right? So you need to have the government to help provide those kind of infrastructure or institution. And by that, you also need to have a facilitation state to help the entrepreneurs and so on. And in this process, industrial policy is essential because the government need to improve the institution or infrastructure according to the change in the economies. And the government resources is limited. And area for improvement is so much. If you go to a developing country, you can see everything needs to be improved, right? But the government resources is limited. And under that kind of situation, the government needs to set a priority about how to use their limited resources in the most effective way to help the entrepreneurs in sectors which they have latent competitive advantages and allow that to have adequate infrastructure and institution, and so they can turn latent into actual in the most fastest way. And so with that, the government needs to have industrial policy in order to improve its efficiency of using the government limited implementation capacity or other financial resources and so on. And can we use this to really explain those successful phenomena and most countries fail? So let me try. In 2008, the Growth Commission headed by Michael Spence and Robert Solow and supported by the World Bank, they released a report called the Growth Commission Report. And they identified certain economies after the Second World War. They were able to grow at 7% or more continually for 25 years or more. Okay, 7% or more continually for 25 years or more. And a high-income country, we know average they grow at about 3%. So if you can grow 7% or more, you double the growth rate of the advanced country. And continually for 25 or more years, certainly you can catch up, close the gap, right? And they find these certain economies, they have 5 characteristics, stellar aspects. One, they are open economy. Second one, they enjoy macro stability. Third one, they have high savings and high investment. And they all market economy will move towards a market economy. And they also have capable, competent, credible, and proactive government. Okay, those are the stellar aspects of those 13 successful economies. And after the release of this report, certainly developing countries were very excited. Now we find a way to be successful. So Michael Spence was invited to advise the government, like you, very often. But when he went to meet the head of state, and the head of state asked, well, how can we turn our country from stagnation to dynamic economic growth? Then certainly Michael Spence introduced this study, but he said, those 5 stellar aspects are ingredients of success. But there's no recipe. But if no recipe, you cannot cook, right? And so And those recipe, how can the developing country follow? Just like you try to advise the government, you not only need to tell them what are the important, but you also need to tell the government how to do it, right? And there's no recipe, they do not know how to do it, right? But actually, from the new structural economics point of view, there's a recipe. That is to follow the competitive advantages. And if they want to follow the competitive advantages, there are two institutional preconditions. One is market economy, to provide the right relative prices and to provide the incentive and to guide the choice of the entrepreneur, right? We just discussed that. And you also need to have a state to help the entrepreneurs to turn the competitive advantage from latent to actual, right? And that are the status facts 4 and 5. And if you follow the competitive advantages, certainly you will be open economy. You produce whatever you are good at, you export, and you import whatever you are not good at. So that's condition, status fact number 1. And secondly, if you follow your competitive advantages, you will be competitive. You are not going to have that indigenous crisis. Unlikely, less likely to have that. And also, even you are exposed to the external shock, because they are competitive, they accumulate foreign exchanges, and the government fiscal position will be healthy. They will have a much larger capacity to carry out counter-cyclical intervention. And so certainly their macroeconomy is going to be much more stable than otherwise, right? So that's the condition number 2. So that's fact number 2. And then I already mentioned, if you follow your competitive advantages, certainly you are going to have high saving and high investment. So that's number 5. So the new structural economics can explain those successful economies, why they were successful. Okay. Then it can also explain why the structuralism failed. I think the intention of structuralism was good, advising the developing country to invest in those kind of advanced sectors. I think to raise their productivity. But the trouble is that they went against their competitive advantages. And so their cost of production will be too high. And they are not competitive. As a result, they need to be protected. And this kind of protection will cause all kind of distortion and rent shaking and so on. And as a result, they became very inefficient. Even you build up those kind of industry, but the cost of production will be too high, and they need to be protected. And so that's the reason why they became white elephant. And how come the East Asian economies, they perform well? They started with those kind of labor-intensive traditional industry. And those are their competitive advantage, right? And with the government support, they quickly turn those in kind of actual competitive advantage, and they can be competitive in international market. That's the ideal competitive advantages. They can export, they can earn foreign exchanges, and they can grow faster, save more, and then they can quickly upgrade their factor endowments and their competitive advantages, and they climb up the industrial ladder very quickly. And that's the reason why they were successful. And we can also understand how come the Washington Consensus, those kind of neoliberalism recommendation did not work. Because most of the transition economy, no matter in the socialist or non-socialist, they started with the government intervention to build up large-scale modern industries. And those kind of industry went against their competitive advantages. Without government protection and subsidy, they could not survive. And in that regard, those kind of protection and subsidies were endogenous to the need of protect those kind of non-viable industries. And when you advise the government to remove all those kind of distortions, those kind of industry failed because they could not survive. And also the neoliberalism advised the government against the use of industrial policy to support the new industry, even they were consistent with their competitive advantages. And as a result, countries follow this kind of approach, encounter what we call premature deindustrialization. Because the old industry failed, new industry could not emerge. And that's the reason why they perform poorly. And how come those kind of piecemeal and a gradual approach work? Because they are pragmatic. They continue to provide the necessary protection and subsidies to the old industries so they could maintain stabilities. And the government also actively facilitate the entry and the growth of the new industry which are consistent with their competitive advantages. Like China, those kind of labor-intensive industry, and they were supported by the government, so they can grow quickly. And when they grow quickly, so you can stability and dynamic economic growth. Not only so, when you have a quick, growth of your new industries, and they accumulate capital quickly, and so gradually those kind of old industries turn from against the country's competitive advantages to become consistent with the country's competitive advantages. And once they are consistent with the country's competitive advantages, protection and subsidies become not necessary. And the government can remove the subsidies and protection and move to a market economy. That's how China completes the transition from a dual track to now basically a market economy. And other transition economy follow this approach. Basically, they have a similar pattern. And so what is the implication from this understanding? Well, so poor development performance in a developing country is due to the fact that the government policies for development and transition were shaped, guided by inadequate ideas, structuralism or neoliberalism. And secondly, poverty and the middle income trap are not destiny. And in the World Bank, we often say, our dream is a world free of poverty. I think it's possible if we have the right idea to guide the development and transition policy in the developing country. Because if a country, a developing country, follow their competitive advantages in a market economy with a facilitation state, they can grow very dynamically for decades, like China now, 45 years. And they can move from low income to middle income, or even to high income in one generation or two generations. By that, certainly, a world free of poverty is possible. Just like China, in 2021, we declare the elimination of absolute poverty in China. And during those past 45 years, more than 900 million people were pulled out of poverty. I think that's possible for every country if they have the right ideas. But if you have this right idea, I think a change in mindset is necessary. Because in the past, developing country always use developed country as reference. And they try to own what the developed country have, they do not have, or try to do what developed country could do well and they could not do well. For example, in a structuralism, advising the developing country to own the advanced industry, and the developing country did not have that. And like neoliberalism, or to some extent new institutional economics, advise the developing country to own the similar institutions as in the developed country. Intentions are always good, but the results are always poor. And so from the new structural economics, just the opposite. Look at what you have now. That's their endowments, right? They have a lot of labor force. They have a lot of natural resources. And they don't have capital. Look at what you have now. Based on what you have, what you can do well. Instead of what the developed country can do well, what you can do well. And certainly that is their competitive advantage, right? And then, in a market economy, with the facilitation state, to make what you can do well, scale up that, to make them competitive. And by that, every country can change the path of their development immediately, just like China after 1978. Before 1978, China followed the kind of structuralist approach, and China was poor. But after 1978, China followed this new approach. On the one hand, maintain stability by providing necessary support to the old sector to maintain stability, but actively facilitate the new sector which are consistent with China's comparative advantage. And that's the reason why China was able to have 9% growth for 45 years. And the economic size increased 47 times. Right? And I think every country, if they have right ideas, they could have a similar performance. So you need to change the mindset. And the new structural economics, starting as a development economics, try to understand how to make the developing country have a much better development performance. But by bringing in the structural differences in country at a different level stage of development into the economic analysis, actually it's going to affect almost every subdiscipline of modern economics. Because so far, every subdiscipline of modern economics, for example, financial economics or labor economics or space economics, industrial economics, and so on, they always have the theory generated from the experiences of the advanced country. And all those theories actually embedded in the structure of the advanced country. But as I said, the structural developing country will be different. For example, I'm sure some of you study financial economics. And if you read the textbook, always advise you how to develop venture capitals, how to develop stock market, how to evaluate the value of corporate debt, right? Those are suitable for the advanced country. But if you go to a developing country, 80%, 90% of the production are in the traditional agriculture, small-scale agricultural households, or small-scale labor-intensive industries. Can they list their stock market? This on the stock market? Can they rely on venture capital for investment? Can they issue corporate debt? No, and so those kind of recommendations are not suitable for the developing country, right? So I think by bringing the structural difference, the heterogeneity, and the endogeneity of structure into our economic analysis, and it has implication for all the subdiscipline, and so we can have a structural evolution. And just like John, I'm honored to be entrusted by the Ministry of Education to find a way to improve the curriculum in economics. And so it allows me to have the opportunity to bring this kind of structural perspective into our curriculum. And hopefully, in other developing countries, they can also bring this kind of structural perspective into their curriculum. Thank you very much.
Well, originally we would have the discussion by Robbie Kanbar, but we are towards the end of the day. We have 15 minutes for questions and answers from the audience to both John Hopcroft and Justin Lin. And then we retired to the AD White House, just up the hill, 5-minute walk, and there will be refreshments, wine and beer for those with a 21-year-old driver's license or showing the age of 21 years. But that will be, you'll be welcome, and the food doesn't require a driver's license for the undergraduates who are here. Okay, why don't we have questions and answers, and I will pass the microphone.
Thank you, Professor Li. It's a great talk. I have a question about China's R&D investment. We all know that China's government has invested a huge amount of money on R&D investment, but the original innovation, like from 0 to 1, this kind of innovation, is rarely happening in China. So what's your insight about the performance or the effectiveness of China's R&D investment? And do you have any solutions in your mind? Thank you.
Well, good questions. In the early stage of development, as I mentioned, China is a developing country, has a huge gap with the advanced country. And at that time, China can rely on the latent advantages, can borrow in learning, and as a way for technology innovation, industrial grading. But now China reached a stage. Many industries already own the global technological frontier, like in household appliances, like in solar power and so on, and like electronic vehicles. For that, Chinese industries are already on the global technological frontier. And if China try to be competitive in that industries continuously, China need to do indigenous R&D. And so that's the reason why China need to invest in R&D now. That's one reason. And secondly, related to the geopolitical tension. And there are some kind of technological embargo to China and try to choke China. And certainly for that, China also need to do indigenous R&D in order to overcome those kind of difficulty. And for that, 2 reasons. And I think that for the first reason, because more industry, China will come to the global frontiers, and China need to increase the indigenous R&D. And for the second one, I hope the relation can be improved, and so we don't have to invest so much in trying to overcome those kind of political difficulties.
Okay. Other questions?
So I have a question for Justin. I was in your class last year in Peking University. I always have a question that if all countries in the world are producing capital-intensive products, then who is going to produce the labor-intensive products like shoes and clothes? That's my question.
That's a very good question. When China,
Is this for Justin?
it's to me, right?
Yeah,
Okay. Yeah. When China started this kind of transition from planned economy, develop capital-intensive industry, to the market economy, and started to have export-oriented strategies going into the labor-intensive industry. That was the time when I returned to China in '87. And I participated in many conferences. And many people questioned the possibility for China to went into the labor-intensive industry. Because before China entered into this kind of labor-intensive industry, at the time, the main production base was Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore. And in Korea, in Hong Kong, only employ 500,000. And also in Singapore, less 500,000. And Taiwan, only about 1.5 million. And Korea about 2 million. So the combine of the production in labor-intensive industry in the 1980s was about 5 million. But China has 1 billion population. And at that time, they think that there was no such a large market if China entering into the labor-intensive industries. But actually, in China, when I was at the World Bank, I did a study for the light manufacturing in African countries. And so I do some study in shoemaking alone. In China, employ 9 million people in shoemaking alone. And if you go to, let's say, textile, more than 15 million in the government. I think it's that, when you have so many people who go to the labor-intensive industries, they were employed, they raised their income, right? And they will consume more. And also you look, China export and import was about balanced. So China certainly provide good for the rest of the world, but also provide a market for the production in other countries. So if all the country went into the labor-intensive industries, their income is going to increase so much, and their demand is going to increase so much. For example, before the transition, we often say, 新3年,旧3年,红红补补过3年. So if you go to the closet, how many clothes you have? Maybe 2 or 3 pieces, right? But now you go to the closet, how many clothes you have? Over 100, right? And so I think that is, the rate of income will create a market.
Okay, question back here.
Thank you for both of your presentation. I do have a question for Dr. Hopcroft. So it's very practical. I've been sitting here and very inspired by your lecture, and it reminds me why I decided to be a faculty member in the university, because I love teaching, love my students, and I also have passion for my research. So I have a very a practical question for you. Is like you mentioned before, some of the Chinese students, like PhD students, they don't know, or they are not quite sure about their future research direction. So as a PhD student supervisor, should we give them a topic? And the second one is, how can we help and support them to find their own passion?
That's a very important question, because the goal of a PhD student is to learn, is to be educated, not to do an advisor's research for them. And the best thing to help someone be really successful is not to tell them what to do. So I'll just tell you about my first PhD student, Alejo. When he came in and asked me to be his advisor, I asked him what he wanted to work on. And he told me something that I thought was really stupid. But I didn't tell him to change. And I realize now, if I had said, it'd be much better if you worked on this research project that I'm working on, he probably would not have been anywhere near as successful. But what he did instead, since he was excited about what he had proposed, he kept changing it and modifying it over time, and eventually converted it to something that got him the Turing Award. And I realized that if I had told my advisors, here's a good topic, they would not have been anywhere near as successful as they have been. Another one I'll mention, Gilles Boussard. He came to me and he mentioned he wanted to work on something I knew nothing about. So I just told him, I said, look, I'm happy to be your advisor. And I don't know anything about that topic, but we'll learn. And he has since moved into quantum communication and got 2 of the highest awards in physics because he was doing what he was excited about. And you've got to let your students, explore and eventually find what they really enjoy doing and want to do. Yeah.
We have time for one question. And then we'll open the floor for our Ava and Robbie to close the symposium.
Thank you, Professor, for delivering the speeches. So I do have a question for Professor Justin. I'm now a master's student in econ, and we're focusing on the automobile industry in the globe. And we have found a phenomenon called path dependency, and that, for example, the quality and sales of electrical vehicles by the conventional car companies like Toyota or BMW are actually worse or not better than those newly founded firms like Tesla in the US or Li Xiaopeng in China. So we believe one reason for this phenomenon is because they have a kind of inertia to produce gasoline vehicles. So their quality may not be good as these newly founded firms. So one question for these is like, for example, China used to have comparative advantage on the how can I say, the labor-intensive industries. How can they transform or to the capital concentrated industries, or if that cost is large enough, how do they overcome this?
Well, very good question. Yeah. If you follow your competitive advantages according to, as you say, by your competitive advantages, you're going to accumulate the capital so fast, and you are going to lose competitive advantages in sector which you are producing. And by the profit motivation, they have to change. If they stay in the auto industry, they will die. And so that will force them to find new industry that they can go. Just as you mentioned, like Kodak, the path dependent, so they failed. And so now, if BMW and Mercedes-Benz, they want to stay, then they need to switch to a new paradigms.
Well, very quickly, just an observation. One issue which Justin has written about elsewhere, and indeed I've written a paper in a volume that Justin has published, is on the question of inequality in China, if I may say a little bit of it. It's very, very interesting. Okay? So when China's economy opened up in the 70s, there was a fall in inequality.
Yeah.
But then, after 10 years of that, there's a spectacular rise in inequality. And in that period, about 30 years ago, Cornell PhD student, Zhang Xiaobo, and I, now distinguished professor at Peking University, we were part of a group that pointed to this rise in inequality at the time. And there's a very interesting apocryphal story. Manmohan Singh, who was later to become the finance minister and prime minister of India, at the time was part of the North-South Commission, an NGO. Yeah. He went to see Deng Xiaoping. Yeah. And this is an apocryphal tale. He said, but sir, Manmohan Singh was a good social democrat. He said, but sir, aren't you concerned that all these reforms are going to lead to an increase in inequality? And Deng Xiaoping said, I hope so. See, because he had an appropriate, he had a model in his mind, which is that these sorts of changes will lead to an increase in inequality, but that is something that we're prepared to tolerate for a while, but only for a while. Okay? After 2005, as you well know, the harmonious development and all that sort of kicked in. And views shifted, views changed, there was pragmatic adjustment. And now, 30 years later, Zhang Xiaobo and I have written a paper in one of the latest issues of Journal of Comparative Economics called the Great Chinese Inequality Turnaround. Yeah. Inequality in China is still very high, but it has plateaued and may even be beginning to turned down.
Yeah.
Because there was an adjustment that was done within the system, within the political economy system. And that raises so many interesting questions about how, even within a so-called autocracy, which doesn't have the characteristics of US and so on, there is in fact responsiveness, there is adjustment to facts on the ground. So that was my one observation that I had there.
Thank you. Amy?
I really want to just thank both of them for inspiring talks. I am truly inspired by how much effect John had on a country's education, which I couldn't imagine was possible. And I guess I'm also inspired by your talk and how, inspired by China and the story you presented and the effect you're having. So thank you, everyone, and thanks for the audience. I don't have a contrary remark to make. Okay, thanks a lot.